been increased skepticism about the true reasons why South Africa has enjoyed more than 40 days of uninterrupted power supply, despite Eskom's assertions that it is through disciplined maintenance plan and more solar power. Let's unpack this now as we're joined by independent energy expert Mohamed Madhi. Mohamed, thank you so much for your time and for joining us this evening. As an energy expert, given the current resources that we have in the country and the electricity patterns that we've experienced over the last couple of years, would you say there's a correlation between the no load shedding and the upcoming elections?
Look, it's good evening, and good evening to the viewers. It's very unusual that we have this amount of time without load shedding, given the history of load shedding just prior to this particular period. So statistically, and also, from just an understanding of the overall generation fleet and the current state of Eskom's power generation system, it's very, very unusual. And I think, of course, it's very easy to jump to conclusions as well that it's because of the elections, which would then imply there is a politicization of Eskom and some of the other entities. Whether or not that's not true, I think no one can tell for sure, but certainly it is an unusual time that we are in. But there are some good reasons for this. The weather that we've had up to now has not been as severe as it was last year, for example. So the typical kind of extra load that you get this time of the year, we're not getting as we had last year. We definitely have a lot more private sector power generation going on. So these are factors that are contributing to the reduction in load, but the scale of this reduction is very unusual.
I mean, the Eskom board chair had dismissed some theories that were made with regards to load shedding being averted by the burning of billions worth of diesel. Do you believe that the maintenance efforts that have been put in place are what is helping us to enjoy all this oversupply of electricity?
Look, we don't have an oversupply. We are very far, unfortunately, from an oversupply. We're still not in a position where we can call the grid in a healthy state. We don't have sufficient spinning reserve, and we are very far from a properly functioning electrical energy system. So, but coming back to your question in terms of the maintenance, yes, it has had an effect. It has been undoubtedly beneficial to the plants. It's not the end of the story, and it's not the end of load shedding. So this is very important to understand. It's not the end of load shedding. And I think the critical thing to do now, anyone that says it is the end of load shedding, or any official that asserts that this is now the norm, we need to hold these officials accountable to this level of performance and improving it over time. So this is really the important thing. And if this level of performance does not continue beyond June, July, then those who asserted that we are in a good position and this is now the new baseline, they would have to feel the consequences of this.
And I mean, surely factors such as the weather would be far different in months such as June and July.
It would, assuming that, it's not a mild winter. So assuming we have a normal winter, you will then have a spike in demand. And that spike in demand typically also happens at nighttime, where you don't have as much solar. So it will be a good indication of the state of the grid. But having said that, even though you're not going to have a lot of solar, you have a lot more battery energy storage solutions than in the past, especially than compared to last year, which means that the private sector and those that, that have been able or fortunate enough to put in some sort of battery solutions are able to withstand the load shedding a lot better, are able to provide their own power, and are then drawing less from the national grid.
I mean, when we still speak on the issues of the maintenance efforts, would you somewhat credit some of that maintenance efforts to the former CEO of Eskom, Andre de Ruyter?
Absolutely not. So I think, under the Ruyter's time, we should stop actually going back, as a country, to Andre de Ruyter's time. Andre de Ruyter had his time, and clearly things did not work. Some of the new initiatives and some of the new initiatives by the minister have paid dividends. We have to accept this. It's still far from ideal. There's still a lot more that can be done, and I think there are still some assumptions being made by the minister and those around him that are detrimental to the improvement that we need to have in the country. But nonetheless, there's been a great deal of effort, and it has, paid some dividends, as I've said. Andre de Ruyter's time cannot be analyzed on one aspect alone. One has to look at it in totality, and in my own opinion, it was a complete failure.
Even though some economists argue that the planned maintenance plans were put in place during his time, were started during his time, and we're only starting to reap the benefits now. Would you still argue against that?
I think that's incorrect. Let's be clear. I used to be a power station engineer a very long time ago. Eskom always had a set of maintenance plans. In fact, you don't build a power plant and you don't operate a power plant for many years without having a very specific and very detailed ops and maintenance regime in place. What had happened during the dark years of Eskom, if we can call it that, was those were ignored, those were not followed properly, those were underfunded, but the actual plans and so on existed. And what needed to be done and how it needed to be done on the power stations existed. So it's not as if Andre de Ruyter came in, who had no clue about the energy generation industry, and suddenly now put these plans into place. As I said, those plans existed before. What's happened now over the last while is there is a lot more attention and focus on paying attention and executing on those plans.
I mean, still speaking on Andre de Ruyter, he was found quoted very recently saying that Eskom is not in a fixable state in its current form, and that South Africans should move away from the nostalgia of what Eskom used to be and start looking at other options. What's your take on that?
I would agree with that. I think that is true. That's probably a very good insight, very good statement from Andre. We are overly fixated on Eskom. Eskom is certainly not the solution for the future, and Eskom will never get back to its time when it was ranked amongst the top 5 in the world in terms of major power utilities. And the reason for that is it is based on the premise of coal-fired generation plants. These plants are outdated, they are more expensive than newer forms of energy, and they are much harder to maintain and will continue getting much harder to maintain over time. So Eskom has to be viewed for what it is, and it is not in the best position to exploit the new forms of energy that are now available for us to use. There are more nimble firms, there are more capable and competent companies that are able to exploit these technologies, that are able to deploy these technologies. Eskom's entire capability up to now, its primary focus was built on coal-fired generation and deploying coal-fired power plants and utilizing and distributing the electricity from that. And it's not an organization that is fit for understanding or optimizing new forms of energy.
I mean, you're speaking of these new forms of energy, and earlier on you mentioned the private sector power supply that has gotten us through this over 40 days of no load shedding. What would you say to those who argue in terms of the price that now electricity could cost when private players come into play, and what that would mean for the most hardest hit South Africans?
So the private sector, there's two aspects of private sector power. There's the IPPs who are building their own power plants and selling it to Eskom. And in the past, these were priced exorbitantly. So they were getting very good rates on a per kilowatt hour basis. Those rates have come down, a lot more rational now, and actually quite affordable and a lot cheaper in most cases than what Eskom can generate power at. The second aspect of private sector power is where, on a willing buyer, willing seller basis, you have private sector power generation selling power to private sector clients. And in fact, in almost all cases, that power is cheaper than what municipalities or Eskom provides. So it's more economical. And in fact, the hardest hit in society, unfortunately, are facing a really dire time looking forward. Because what is going to happen is Eskom will not be the provider of choice to most of industry and to most of the, the ordinary off-taker, the people in the residential market, because they would be able to install alternative systems that provide power cheaper. So those that cannot install those systems are now going to be reliant on Eskom, and Eskom's power is going to be a lot more expensive. So you have the most vulnerable in society ultimately going to be dependent on Eskom, and Eskom is not going to be the best provider of power. And this is a situation we need to avert. And the way to avert this is stop the fixation on Eskom.
Going forward, stopping that fixation on Eskom, can South Africans be hopeful that we'll have more than 40 days of no load shedding?
I think we will have more than 40 days, of no load shedding, because it would be very blatant and very abrupt if straight after May the 29th, we suddenly had load shedding again. It does depend on a variety of factors. I personally don't think that, it's only due to the election. There are some underlying factors, and as I said, the climate before. So it's an interesting time. No one can give you, unfortunately, a specific answer. But what I can say for sure is that load shedding is not over. We're going to have, at the slightest indication of higher demand, we are going to have more load shedding. And the generation fleet is not yet in a healthy state. And those open cycle gas turbines are running at rates where they should not be running, and they are not designed for, not meant to be running at those rates.
All right. Thank you so much for your time this evening. That was independent energy expert Mohamed Madhi.